and get started. And because people will be able to see the beginning of the video, they can do that. So welcome to all alumni and other guests to our latest installment of Stanford Alumni for Climate Action and our SACA, our climate talks. So I'm Bill Gorham, class of 74, along with Gerald and Naomi. I'm the founder and chair of SACA. I'm a marine biologist, a father, and a grandfather. I organized SACA because of my concern for leaving a healthy planet for later generations. The crisis is upon us and we cannot delay action, which, as the SACA name implies, is all about action. The SACA is a subcommittee of Stanford Alumni and Sustainability. We're a group of alumni, students, or as I consider them, larval alumni, family members, others in the Stanford community who are keen to protect the environment and meet climate change with positive solutions. We host virtual events with top speakers to learn more and raise awareness about the causes and consequences of global warming and actions we can take to reverse and adapt to those effects. Our goal is to inspire and enable everyone to take action to restore climate balance to our planet. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. Now, in a moment, I'll be introducing our speakers, but first, some technical information. This would be a good time to make sure you're muted and your camera is off, unless you want to have your every move for the next hour memorialized forever and ever on our video, because this program is being recorded. Within a week, we'll email a link to the recording to all registrants. It'll be posted on our SACA YouTube channel. The email will also have a link to SACA's Climate Activist Resource Guide, which contains a wide range of information on climate change and what you can do right now to help. If you have questions about tonight's talk or other matters related to SACA, please post them in the chat for all to see. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible at the conclusion of the conversation. We're hoping to close by 6 p.m. Pacific time. Now I'd like to introduce our tonight's speakers. We have the honor and pleasure of hearing from Professor Gerald Torres, a pioneer in the field of environmental justice. And just what that actually means, we're about to find out. As I said, he's a member of the class of 74. It's a good vintage, if I could say so. Gerald will be forgiven for heading to Yale for his JD, but he then went on to University of Michigan for an LLM. After a diverse career, Gerald ultimately returned to Yale as a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of the Environment and a joint appointment as professor of law at Yale Law School. His distinguished career includes serving in the Clinton administration as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And he serves on the Board of Trustees for the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC. One issue in particular Gerald has focused on is how ethnically and racially marginalized communities often suffer most from the negative effects of climate change and environmental policies, and how we can fix that. Our moderator for this evening is Naomi Boak. Naomi is a founding member of SACA and an Emmy Award-winning film producer and environmental activist. Following her passion for brown bears, she was selected to be a media ranger at Katmai National Park in Alaska, which has the largest concentration of brown bears in the world. Naomi educates millions worldwide in her on-camera weekly liveexplore.org broadcasts. Heard of Fat Bear Week? Naomi has produced and co-written this annual social media sensation for 3 years. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Gerald and Naomi.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Yep.
So it's a great pleasure to be here with Gerald. Full disclosure, Gerald and I have been friends since Stanford. And so this is a lot of fun and a great pleasure for me. And I know that Gerald will have some very interesting and probably provocative things to tell us. So Gerald, you've got a group of people who are really interested in doing something about climate change. And so I'm curious, let us know just exactly what environmental justice is.
Well, environmental justice, in the simplest terms, is concerned about the distributional impacts both of pollution, but also all of the kind of negative environmental impacts of our industrial society, But it also focuses on procedures and the way decisions get made, and asks questions about the justice of the procedures as well as the justice of the distribution. So those are the two main foci. It really started. It's one of those movements that it truly is ground up. So that it didn't come from the academy. It didn't come from Big Green. It came from communities that wanted explanation for things that they were experiencing. It was that grassroots action over a generation now that kind of has led to its the legal formulation for addressing questions of environmental justice. The federal government's involvement kind of officially began in the Clinton administration with the Executive Order 12898, which first of all defined what environmental justice communities are, and then it instructed the agencies to start to develop strategic plans for incorporating questions of justice and equity in their decision-making and in the programs that they administer. The most current administration has gone further, and it's issued a couple of executive orders, basically telling people that if you want a more equitable society, then you've got to be concerned not just at the economic end, but on the way in which burdens are distributed, and we can talk at length on the various kinds of issues that arise. The climate change has exacerbated the impacts of distributional inequalities. So that if you take, say, redlining, which is,
I mean, how so has it influenced?
Well, I was going to give you an example. The example is redlining, which I assume everyone knows. It was effectively federal discrimination in housing mortgage loans that created and contributed to the development of segregated communities. If you overlay a couple of things with the impact of redlining, you get things like the less green cover, for example, in cities, more traffic, heavier traffic patterns through those neighborhoods, things like that. And the one that interested me recently is I was reading about the impact of the kind of reduced canopy in poor and racially marginalized communities. And it has, three big effects, right? One is those neighborhoods tend to be hotter. So the urban heat island effect is exacerbated in those communities. Second, air pollution tends to be higher because canopies actually capture and knock down particulate matter. So asthma rates are higher. And then the one that actually surprised me, but it actually probably shouldn't have been a surprise, is it has mental health effects as well. That having access to green space actually reduces stress. And so those impacts, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as kind of justice implicated, in fact is, because it means that a different set of burdens, and especially the heat island effect, which is directly climate related, have more severe impacts in poor and racialized communities. So that's one example.
So, I mean, it's interesting that when you talk about this evolution of a notion of environmental justice, it takes time. And I think one of the frustrations among certainly the people who are listening right now, and among a lot of people, is there's growing urgency to do something. And so people feel at a loss. But I think besides having a desire to do something, we need patience. And how do you balance those two?
Well, you need to act, right? And you can act in ways big and small. And it seems to me that the first, the prerequisite is an awareness of the challenges that climate poses for us. But it's not as if this was a great surprise that was suddenly sprung on us. I mean, I went to a lecture when I was an undergraduate. I hate to say how many years ago that was, right? But almost 50 years ago, in which the impact of atmospheric CO2 on climate was, discussed. And I have to say there was a lot of pessimism even then that we would be able to do anything. But the reality is that the world has been mobilized. Now, when you think about what it took to create the problem that we're facing, right? It's going to take something that large to get to the place we want to be, so that we can avoid the kind of the negative cycle that will basically be it. So I think you have to act, but I think you have to know that they're big things and they're big pieces you have to move around on the board. And so you've got to be patient, because it requires working with people and working with institutions and thinking about how our economy is going to be reorganized, and making sure that the reorganization of the economy as it moves forward, especially in the energy sector, doesn't create additional problems. So in energy, the environmental justice approach to that is contained under kind of the rubric of just transition. So ensuring that the transition to fewer fossil fuels and less carbon intensive energy generation doesn't leave some people out. And so, there are a lot of things to think about. But one of the things that is kind of remarkable is the rate of replacement of of automobiles from combustion engine to electric. That's proceeded at a pace that is far faster than people imagined.
What do you think that is?
Well, I think a couple of reasons. One, I think the automobile industry recognizes that that's the future, and they're making electric vehicles that Americans primarily want to drive, and the infrastructure is mainly state governments, but the federal government getting involved too, is creating an infrastructure that supports that transition. So I forget what I should have had these statistics at my fingertips for you tonight, but I don't. But I was in a conversation with a fellow the other day who, I think, by 2035, we will be well on our way to essentially replacing the consumer fleet. The hard part is going to be the long haul trucks and that kind of that part of the internal combustion fleet. But that's just one example. The other example is the rate of conversion, especially in California, but many states, a conversion to solar, electric, and distributed energy, raising a number of issues as well, which we can talk about. But even here in Connecticut, where I have to say, it's been sunny far fewer days than I would have liked. It's still as
You're a Southern California guy.
I'm used to waking up and thinking, looking out the window, and the only question was whether it was raining or whether it wasn't. Right? If it wasn't raining, it was going to be a beautiful day. But even here, there's been a quick adoption of solar, distributed solar energy.
Yeah, I mean, where I live in Massachusetts, it's a fairly middle class and working class town, and there is solar everywhere. I mean, the state is promoting it a lot, and that's good to see. But I also live in the largest fishing port in the country, and Massachusetts has had an enormous push towards wind energy, and just living amidst that, to see the conflicts and the different interests to have wind power.
Oh, right. No, I was actually. No,
Yeah,
I was glad you raised that, because I was going to say that, you know, Massachusetts is actually working hard to develop offshore wind.
right.
And what they've done, and I think you put your finger on it, right, is they've downplayed the impact on commercial fisheries. And that means commercial fishermen. That means, you know, to the extent that you take seriously the way of life arguments, right, you're going to disrupt ways of life for a lot of those fishing communities. And in New Bedford, I think, I forget how many tons of seafood goes out of that port every year. And what has to happen is that the developers of wind have to acknowledge that conflict, and there has to be some scheme for addressing the shifting of the burden to commercial fishermen.
But I think I mean, that's a very, very tough goal. I mean, I'm seeing it in action. I've got friends in the city government, and they wanted to grab that money from all the wind energy companies, and I have friends who own fishing fleets, and the conflict of interest there is real, and it's large. And so, I mean, I think this gets to a point where I have a question about what is the role of the law in all this.
Well, you know, what's interesting is there already are statutes. They need to be, I think, adjusted or amended to address the impact of wind turbines that are, you know, they're floating turbines. Most of the ones you're talking about in Massachusetts are actually fixed to the shallow part of the continental shelf, where also, you know, where right before it drops off, which is also the main fisheries.
Right.
But there already are statutes that require compensation for oil production rigs that interfere with the not the fisheries as such, but the actual losses to the fishermen. So their gear, you know, the direct material impacts on the fishers, the fleets and the tackle and whatnot. It's already there. And so what we need to do is we need to think about how do we amend those statutes to account for the loss that your friends who own the fleets are experiencing, and how do we amend it to account for the impact that wind turbines will have? Because, you know, the other thing which you know, we could gloss over, just look at, you know, the fossil-free energy that wind is producing, but there's a lot of sonic disturbances, which has a tremendous impact on the reproductive cycles of fish. And Bill could probably tell us about that. He's got way more scientific expertise than probably you or me on this topic. But you know, I started to say that these are complex questions, but just because they're complex doesn't mean we shouldn't address them and shouldn't move towards the reduction of dependency on fossil fuels. But it means, and you asked about environmental justice is, well, justice means taking into account the impact of the transition to non-fossil fuel energy on those fishing communities. And just like you know, the impact of the transition to non-fossil fuel energy on coal miners, and we take that seriously, and it seems to me that we should. That is part of environmental justice too. Yeah. And the law, I mean, so the law is there. Now the question is, you know, the law can be used as a sword or a shield.
Right. I mean, so when, then that brings up the question, when do you use the law? Is it frequently used as a last minute solution? Or does the law come in time? I mean, it seems to me like what you're saying, and just in my local example, the law hasn't caught up yet. I mean, that there are statutes, but those who might advocate for environmental justice, seems to me they haven't quite caught up yet. So they're following in a little late.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, and I want to divide your question up into a couple of parts. One is, when I said law can be a sword or a shield, right? It can be deployed to stop these projects, right? Or to slow down the projects, which means it's going to make them more expensive. On the other hand, the law can also shield people from liability. It seems to me that, and I suspect you were talking about litigation, and what I want people to think about is law a little broader than the courtroom, because this is where I know we have a kind of a broken legislative process right now, but the legislative process is actually really a critical arena for these struggles to take place. The courts can be used to force action and sometimes to put things on the legislative agenda. But it's expensive. It's time consuming. It can be used, to promote or to delay environmental projects. A friend of mine just settled a case in Maine that took 22 years to litigate. I mean, that's I don't know about you, but that seems like a long time to me.
Even at our advanced ages, it seems like
Even
a long time. So again, this on the mind of, I know, most of the people that are with us tonight is, so what do I do about this? I mean, obviously voting has something to do with it if you're talking about legislative solutions, but I think just, I'm using my own example because it's a handy way for me to talk about this, but I listen to these stories. I'm at the dog park in the morning and I'm with the city planner and I'm with the mayor and these other people, but then I'm also with people who own fishing fleets, and I don't know who's putting these conversations together. And it seems to me like that, I'm a communications person, so I seem that something like that has to happen. What do you tell your law students about what they can do?
Well, I mean, I send my students out to do a number of things. Most of them, just go and practice law, but a lot of them do get involved on the policy side. But so that's their kind of their vocational track, right? But you can also start to think about what you can do in your individual life. Right. To reduce the energy you use, to reduce waste, and these are steps that maybe don't feel like action, but they are action. The other thing you can do is you get involved with local communities. You're in the communication, so you have to talk to people. You have to have these conversations, and you have to figure out how to have these conversations that don't deteriorate into kind of blame, but actually think constructively about what we can do. So let me give you an example. The green cover issue that I was talking about earlier. I work with a local land trust that is attempting, so I live in a neighborhood that's got a lot of green space. That's my backyard, in fact. And the local land trust has preserved a lot of land, but what they're trying to do now is to build linkages to the communities that don't have cover, to try to make the access to the land that's been preserved more available. So they're building bike routes. They're sponsoring school trips. They're doing things like that to bring people to these amenities, because you can't create these amenities, but you can also do things like work to plant green cover in your city. So there's a project in New Haven that has just planted its 10,000th tree, and it's students working with some faculty, and they only plant trees when a community member requests them, and those requests have led to increasing the tree cover. They also employ, like recently incarcerated people, to move them into the kind of a conservation training, so that you can approach the problem, the social problem of the impact of having been incarcerated on your job prospects, by training them to do this. The Brooklyn Botanical Gardens is doing the same thing. It's saying, look, the people who rake the leaves or cut the grass, those ought to be the entry points into professional conservationism, so that you can take these people who you don't appreciate as being conservationists, but they're in fact actively engaged with the material recreation of the botanic gardens that we enjoy. And so figuring out how to incorporate those parts of the community, in my view, is also a kind of environmental justice. But it's something you can think about. What can I do in my life that will contribute to some small reduction of the impact that the way I live has on the world? And we all live. I hope that everyone lives well, but living well has a cost, and we need to be conscious of what that cost is, and figure out ways that we can reduce our impact.
I mean, do you think that? Do you think that one of the reasons that environmental justice was a grassroots movement was because those were the people that were feeling the effects, and then felt the need? Whereas I think in our middle class and well-off lives, we can ignore a lot of that if we so choose, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's a couple of things that actually have grown out of the environmental justice movement. One is what I'm going to call a kind of citizen epidemiology, right? Which is some local activists, recognizing clusters of certain illnesses, and then asking, why does this cluster exist here, and then kind of working backwards from that and reverse engineering it to the cause, and then figuring out what they have to do to intervene to reduce that impact, and to get assistance to the people who are afflicted, right? So that's one thing they can do. Also, the rise of citizen science, which is just from people observing what's going on in their community. That also grows out of the environmental justice movement. There are a couple of one of the things that was inspiring to me was going out and meeting these people who first started to document the problems, and then tried to mobilize their other community members to put pressure on those people who have the power to address the problems that they identified. It was initially kind of centered around siting of facilities, but when you go out and talk to environmental justice advocates or activists, what you quickly discover is that, oh no, it's transportation, right? It's parkland, it's drinking water, right? It's not just where you site facilities. So I remember talking to a woman who said, look, the biggest problem for me is there's no safe way for my children to walk to school. Well, is that an environmental justice problem, you think? Well, it is if you think about what transportation planning should have taken into account. Right. And so it says, okay, what I've got to do is to figure out a way to get these people involved in the planning process for future projects and get them in conversations with the people who can ameliorate the problems that they're facing right now. Right. So one other example, lead, which is of course a neurotoxin. It's heavily associated with lead paint, right? But in fact, the main vector for lead consumption was from lead in fuels.
Fuels.
No, lead in fuels, right? So getting lead out of gasoline was a very important thing. In fact, in a schoolyard, the most dangerous place for lead consumption was the sandbox, because it came out of the air in particulate matter, it settled, collected where kids play, right? Kids get dirty, they eat dirt, but it was the lead paint, right? Gave you something that you could focus on, and getting lead out of our environment, and then Flint, of course, the further example of a need to address that. But it's recognizing that the transportation patterns, right, which directed more traffic through poor communities, meant that they were going to be subject to atmospheric lead depositions while there was lead in gasoline and fuel. And it builds up, right? So it doesn't go away. Once it's deposited, it's there, and it has to be at some point remedied, or there has to be some care taken to ensure that it doesn't act as a vector for having an impact on those communities. And that's hard, but it means that thinking about transportation is also thinking about environmental justice.
So do the effects of climate change increase the awareness of these vulnerable populations, and then therefore give an additional push to environmental justice? Or is it become overwhelming in these communities and they're just fighting to?
No, I think what you're seeing currently, or the process that I'm observing, right, is you had environmental justice over here and you had kind of climate action over here. And what you're seeing is the coming together of those two movements, right? So that the term climate justice, right, is a term of relatively recent coinage, but it involves a concern with how climate change, climate disruption disparately impacts some communities as against others. So I think you actually see them coming together and being understood as part of the same problem of equity and justice. And the effort is for climate anyway, is to ensure that the climate action we undertake doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities. But
Yes.
making sure that claims about kind of exacerbated inequalities aren't raised merely as a cudgel to prevent, right, climate action from occurring. I mean, it's sometimes a delicate proposition, but it's it seems to me it's one that has to be addressed directly.
Yeah.
So your fisherman is a perfect example, right? Right. You can't pretend there's not a conflict. But what you've got to do is you've got to get all the parties there, and if you're going to make the judgment in favor of wind, then you have to ask, how are we going to put all of the cost of that transition on these fishing communities? And the answer's got to be no, I think. And so we've got to figure out, what kind of insurance or some version of that we can construct for these communities.
I'm going to switch gears a little and ask you about NRDC, which you've been actively involved with for a long time.
The Earth's best defense, you know that.
Yeah, right, of course. Well, they've done things that in my world have helped a lot. I mean, I'm a great believer in that people protect what they love. And I mean, New York is a good example about that in terms of places like the South Bronx, the sustainable South Bronx, where there was no greenery there. So how are you going to think about in a green desert, how are you going to think about climate change and protecting the environment? You don't know what it is. So you've got to connect people to what's valuable before something like fishing fleets facing economic stress, before that happens, or before people are having health and mental health problems because of these issues. So do you have some examples about NRDC's work in this area?
Well, I mean, both the Penobscot case, the one that I said took 22 years, I consider that both an environmental victory because it was about mercury contamination in the Penobscot River, and addressing the paper mills that were the cause of the problem. But there, the people who were negatively impacted by the mercury is a bioaccumulator, right? So that people who ate or sold fish, right, were implicated. But it had implications for Penobscot people, the tribe up there. So that addressing the contamination is when you look at the fishermen and the people who made their living selling lobsters out of the Penobscot Bay, right, who now can't sell them, right? That's an issue, and you've got to address the concern. But when I talked about the mental health issues, right, one of some of the testimony from that case, right, was from these elder lobstermen who said, look, okay, so I can't sell lobsters. He said, but what haunts me, right, is I was selling this to people I know. I was feeding this to my own family, right? And you knew that I was poisoning that. And I now have to carry that guilt that I was a participant in it. Well, that, as I said, that's an environmental justice issue. Let's take Pebble Mine up in Alaska, if we can finally put a stake through its heart.
Please.
That case continues, right? But the reality is it's also a human rights or environmental justice case, because the indigenous communities around Pebble Mine, the majority of them, the vast majority, I want to say like 80% of the people up there opposed the mine, even though it was touted, right, as a potential economic boon for the community. Well, the reality is when you go and talk to people, right, they'll tell you. And so to kind of got off the point of the question you asked, but I want to go to this, which is using the law to intervene in environmental issues doesn't always give you a way to incorporate, or the environmental laws anyway, a way to incorporate equity issues. Right? Usually until concluding phase when it's either settled and liability is determined and settlement is reached. At that point, you've got to integrate the justice concerns into the formulation of the solution. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. I somehow don't think it did.
What do you think are the most urgent climate issues that impact environmental justice?
Well, the most urgent one affecting coastal communities, right, is the sea level rise. The federal government has already relocated 2 Native communities in Alaska, right? Who basically who've lost land, I mean, due to sea level rise. So coastal communities, especially poor coastal communities, will suffer the most. I think and here we're talking just about climate and environmental justice. Climate disruption, environmental justice. The other thing is so how, one is who bears the cost of that change, and that's again it's a collective problem that we've got to figure out. We can say, okay, these are just sacrifice zones, and they'll lose, but I'd rather not think of it that way. I'd rather think that ways to adapt and build resilience in those coastal communities is critical. That's one. The heat impact on cities is the other. There are far more heat-related deaths annually than cold-related deaths annually. And as the temperature continues to rise, but also to fluctuate, right? So it was 85 in Minneapolis yesterday, by the way. That's what I was told. It was 87 in Vancouver, British Columbia yesterday. Now, I wish we were 85 here. No, kidding. But that's an unusual weather pattern for this time of year. Okay.
Yes.
That means the heat stress is going to fall unevenly because there was a legislator in Texas who responded to the question of what do you do when the temperature rises? He said, "Oh, turn on the air conditioning." Well,
Good answer.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually not the answer, right? And even if it were, it's not the answer for everyone because not everyone has access to that.
Right.
Right. So I would say, weatherizing poor communities, poor housing, making them more energy efficient and contributing to working with programs that do that is actually something you could do to take action that actually both improves people's lives and addresses the impact of energy use. So those kinds of efforts exist. You have to kind of seek them out. I don't know if I haven't been checking the chat, so I don't know whether there's questions that people would like us to answer.
I mean, we do want to get to them. I think it's I just think it's important your last comment, because we're always seeking things that we can do, right?
Right.
And no matter how small, it's important that we seek out those things. But I do think that if you find those places and those local organizations that are trying to do something, it's a way of adding value to one's own community and to the planet. Before we take questions, I just want to ask you if you'd tell us the comment that your son made.
No, I won't.
You
No,
won't.
what Naomi's referring to is my son, who well, I mean, he's my son, so I always thought he was precocious. But when he was in middle school, right, he said to me, you know, look, the world's on fire and it's your fault. You know, yes, kind of. You know, it's like, yeah, I've got to act, right? And you know, he when he was in middle school, he had a lot of big ideas. He also thinks votes should be discounted for age, so that younger voters' votes should count more because they've got more skin in the game long term. You know, I'd like not to focus on that too much, but he does have a point, right? The world we're working on now, right, is the world they're going to inhabit, right? And
Right.
Bill's grandchildren are going to inhabit, and the grandchildren of the people who are watching are going to inhabit. You know, there's actually, in fact, an entire philosophical literature that says we have no, you know, we have no responsibility for people who don't exist yet. You know, that may be true at an analytic level, but at a level which we experience our own connectedness to the past and the future, I think it's just not true. And you know, our ability to situate ourselves in a way that it doesn't, you know, I don't mean for this to sound self-important, but situates ourselves in a way that says, you know, we do have responsibility for the future. That's what being a citizen means too. It means being committed to the community you're part of, so that the institutions you build are sustainable, durable, resilient. And this, of course, includes the institutions that we are building to deal with the stress of climate. And you know, whether it's education, and you know, if I could, you know, make a pitch for Earth Day, if any of you have young grandchildren, I urge you to get the Golden Book on Earth Day. You'll see someone's name in it. But Earth Day, it really is focusing on environmental education, which I think is the big key. And you know, getting involved locally to make sure that there are ways to encourage environmental education, not to indoctrinate people, right, but to make sure that it's part of the science curriculum, say. Right? And that's, you know, that's not nothing.
Yeah, no, it's not nothing. Well, let's, Bill, do you have some questions?
We do. We've had a number of people that have provided some that were very long, some that are more succinct. Why don't we try
Got a
one?
bunch of Stanford people here. It's going to be long.
One from somebody that's clearly in Portland, Oregon. For many years, one of the biggest political battles in Oregon is centered on the building of a new bridge that crossed the Columbia River to connect the states on both sides of that great river, Oregon, Washington. On the other hand, the transportation bureaucracy, the private sector and public sector, wants to build the same kind of bridge as they had become accustomed to over the past 100 years. On the other hand, members of the many communities of color on both sides of that river want a bridge that will contribute to the increased health of communities of color. I think the chances are that the traditional bridge model will win out over the visionary bridges favored by low-income communities that would benefit from a bridge that encouraged travel by foot and by bicycle. The traditional model had funding that is vastly larger than the funding that could be generated by communities of color. How does a visionary progressive citizen lobbyist address this impasse?
Well, first thing you got to do, I mean, the citizen activist, whoever it is, it needs to get involved. And I used to teach a course and still do occasionally called Law and Social Movements. And what it focused on is how do social movements produce durable legal change, right? The secret of all of it, right? It's no secret, right? Is you've got to organize. That means you've got to talk to people who share your concerns, who share your interests, and you've got to figure out who your allies are, and you've got to build connections to those allies, and you've got to make it clear to the people who would otherwise run roughshod over those concerns. That A, you're serious, you have constituents that you can mobilize, and you're not going away. Right. A student of mine, a former student of mine, there's in a case down in Corpus Christi, Texas, right, successfully had alterations made to a bridge that was going to eliminate a historic Black community down there. So it's not impossible, but it does require work, and requires organization. It requires talking to people. It requires, making sure that you're not just outraged, but you take that outrage and you use it to build connections.
Great. Another question. Someone said, I worked for a time for a public defender nonprofit that was doing everything it could to help kids caught in the school to prison pipeline. I'm interested in what you mentioned about the mental health repercussions of their environment on these kids. Can you say more?
Well, no, yeah. I mean, one of the groups, local groups I work with in New Haven, is committed to community gardening, but community gardening that integrates the children in the community for a couple of things. One, because it gets them doing green stuff, right? Watching stuff grow. It allows them to be occupied in a way that is positive as opposed to destructive, and it helps rehabilitate vacant lots, right? So there are things like that. I wish I should have been more prepared. I should have had the citations to that essay on mental health and access to green space, but Tatiana Schlossberg, who used to write for the New York Times and now has a blog. I forget what it's called, but if you look up her name, she has a nice blog post on that. What you want to do is you want to produce an environment that reduces the level of stress that the people in the community feel, and that the Gather New Haven, which is the group I was talking about, right, it focuses on that, right? They also do other things, like they get some of the kids. I'm looking at your background there. They get some of the kids working on boats, right? These kids would never have been on a boat, right? But in fact, it gets them out and working on boats, which changes the idea of what's possible. And the imagination of what's possible is a way both to resist the kind of the mental health impacts of the lack of access to green space, but also to be able to imagine a future for yourself that's productive and doesn't follow kind of the ruts that we're used to seeing.
Yeah. Another question, what do you think about the prospects of the Green Amendment movement, i.e. amending state constitutions? The idea is to enshrine the notion that a healthy environment is a basic civil liberty. Note, 3 states have passed it already and 9 more are considering it. The work of Maya van Rossum?
The back when Earth Day happened in the 1970, a number of states actually did pass right to healthy environment. We tried to get an amendment like this passed in Texas. We figured our allies were fishermen and hunters, and so our bumper sticker was "Hunt, Fish, Vote." I think it's a useful thing. The hard part is many courts have viewed the existing constitutional provisions as not self-executing, which means that they then require legislative action to implement the constitutional protection. That's an issue that people should take into account as they lobby for or try to design state amendments to state constitutions to ensure that it doesn't just become kind of a hortatory provision of the Constitution, but in fact one that has real substantive meaning.
Good. Another one, it's more around Stanford. Has there been progress, and you may or may not have any direct experience with this, but has there been progress in East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park, and parts of Redwood City? The areas close to 101 and east of 101 have fewer trees, are lower in elevation, flooding, and dirtier air. They are also near local airports for noise. Thoughts?
I don't know anything about those specific communities, but if you're there, and Stephanie Safdie, who's works in the environmental law clinic at Stanford, I get to brag, she's a former student. You can reach out to her. I'm sure she has insight in that. In fact, I chatted with the environmental clinic at the law school a couple of months ago to give them some ideas about what they might do to work in the environmental justice area. And so I would urge you to reach out to them. My suspicion is that you know they're already paying attention to that. But you did highlight, whoever asked the question, I've forgotten, you did highlight exactly the problem facing those communities. You know, these communities are also probably, I suspect, now kind of pricey, aren't they? Isn't real estate going up there? I mean, East Austin, which used to be the black and brown part of Austin, you know, is now hip, right? So the property values are going up, and you know, places like Austin I think Austin's the biggest city in the country losing black population the fastest. Because they're getting priced out of the communities, so they're not moving far away, but they're moving out of Austin. You know, my son, who made a film about Austin, one of the characters in this film, as they're driving through East Austin, is talking on the phone to someone who's off camera and says, "Look, I just discovered this part of Austin. You know, and nobody lives here." That's part of the problem.
Yeah. Let me throw in one of my own. And I appreciate your observations about how many people can contribute in different ways to in their own way to climate activism. Any suggestions for us at SACA, how we can expand our reach to different groups of alumni?
You know, one of the great things at a place like Stanford, right, is that it produces incredibly hardworking, dedicated, smart people. I would, you know, if there are members of the Stanford community in your community, right, just something as simple as having a conversation with them is a way to start. If they're not already engaged in SACA, calling them up and saying, you know, I went to Stanford too, and you know, let's have a coffee.
Yeah.
It sounds so pedestrian. It sounds so, you know, God, is that all you're suggesting? But you know what? I know I shouldn't cite Richard Nixon for any number of reasons, but you know, when he was building the conservative movement, right, what he said is you got to create places where people can talk, and they've got to be able to talk and meet regularly. Right? He knew what he was doing, right? And I'd urge that same strategy for people who want to produce positive change. A place to talk, a place to meet regularly.
That's one of the things.
I don't know if we're gonna. I saw a question pop up in the chat about the mobilizing technological change. Technological change is going to be important. Institutional change is also important. And I don't think this is one of this technological change is going to be important for addressing the pressing needs, but we're not going to just engineer our way out of the problem. I mean, that's, you know, there are physical limits, and we've got to appreciate that we can't engineer past those physical limits. We've got to, you know, they're hard limits, and we've got to recognize them. But I encourage.
We're in a culture that doesn't recognize limits. Problem.
One of the things that's really come through, and you mentioned it as you were just talking, Gerald, it's communication. And it's interesting, as a scientist, it's like, well, we've got the science that we have to figure out. In the engineering, we have to do the engineering, but it seems it's the communication. It's the communication in a way that we are talking to each other and not past each other, or not
Exactly.
people. And that's where the storytelling comes in. That's where Naomi's Fat Bear Week of getting people to really be connected with what they love. And as you said, your area behind you, your woods, what's behind me, that's where connecting people to that, and then have the opportunity for honest, civil, constructive discussions is what it's really going to be all about. My dog thinks it's right too.
When I lived in Minnesota, one of the people I met is a geographer, and unfortunately, a lot of colleges have limited geography departments. But he wrote a book. It's got an unfortunate name. The title is Topophilia, but it asks the question: how do we recognize the landscapes we love? And without wanting to sound too sappy, figuring out what we love about the place we live, or the place we want to live, right, is also part of the conversation as well, I think.
We're a little past 6. We've run pretty much to the end of the questions. There's a couple that seem a little bit more provocative, but I think I'll leave it at that. What I'd really like to do is for you or both of you to provide sort of your last closing comments. I hope you found a chance to share your conversation with us has been enjoyable. I certainly know I've really appreciated it.
Naomi, I yield to you first.
Yes, because you should have the last word. I don't know that I want to give it to you, but I will. No, I think that you've given us a lot to think about and to talk about and to move forward with. And I think one of the things that this group, SACA, is doing and wants to do in the future is to have those conversations and to be, I think one of the best things we could do is be a catalyst, and a catalyst that presents resources to people. Because we're not going to do something very quickly. And I think, your theme of action and patience comes through. And I think that's something important for us to remember. And I'm so grateful that you joined us tonight, Gerald. I think this was great.
Well, my question, does this group have a running bibliography available?
No.
Because you should have a running bibliography. So resources that people can go to the website, find stuff. I'm interested in this question, this is what I want to find. Anyway, my closing words is that it's not just thought that builds solidarity, it's acting together. And so I'd encourage you to act, because that's how solidarity is constructed. So I want to thank you for having me tonight. It's been fun. Naomi, it's always fun to see you. So what Naomi didn't tell you is we actually were housemates for a while too.
Yes. So we have a lot of blackmail on each other. So
exactly.
That's why we're
and it's nice contributing to Stanford in this way too. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of SACA, thank you, Gerald and Naomi, and to all our attendees, thanks for joining us. And now, as we were talking about, it's now your turn, attendees and the rest of us, and my dog is very excited. We need to remove any excuses that we might be making for not taking action on climate change. As Al Gore recently said in Meet the Press, we, the people, have to solve this. Our survival as a species may depend upon it. We have the solutions. It's up to us. We can do this. So follow us on SACA Facebook page to learn more about future events. And speaking of future events, please join us in 2 weeks, again, Thursday, this time, May 18th, for a presentation by Aurora Winslide and 2 of her colleagues at Stanford's Office of Sustainability, as they're described the last decade of progress advancing Stanford's sustainability efforts and campus operations. We'll send the information for joining the meeting in a subsequent email to all of our SACA mailing list. So thanks for joining us. We hope to see you at your next event. And again, thank you very much, Gerald. and Naomi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.